Chapter 5 Wilhelm van Astrea. Let us speak of the man named Wilhelm Trius. Wilhelm was born the third son of the Trius family, a family of local nobles in the kingdom of Lagunica. The Trius family was an old, storied family, granted land along the kingdom's northernmost border with the Holy Kingdom of Gutsuko. That said, its fame as a family of warriors was a thing of the past. By the time of Wilhelm's birth, it had become a small, weak, baronial family, with only a meager fief and a tiny populace to its name. In real terms, it was no more than an example of nobility fallen from grace. Wilhelm's brothers were well removed from him in age, and his upbringing had no connection to inheritance of family leadership. Furthermore, he, lacking the aptitude for civil government of his brothers, encountered wielding the sword as his one path to leading a future. The sword decorating the great hall of their mansion had once been used by a string of men in the Trius family to gain fame as warriors for the kingdom. But to the present Trius family, it was simply a treasured sword to be admired on the wall. Even Wilhelm did not remember what triggered it. But when he drew the treasured sword, which he had never before even set hands upon, out of its scabbard, the way he was instantly captivated by the beauty of the steel, that he remembered distinctly. Before he knew it, he'd been taking the family sword on his own to the mountains out back, swinging it from morning till night. The first time he touched the sword, he was 8. He became accustomed to the length and the weight of the blade, and when his limbs grew so that they were no longer mismatched, Wilhelm was 14, and the finest sword wielder of the domain. I'll go to the capital and enter the royal army. Then I'll become a knight. And it was at 14 years old that Wilhelm spoke those words and ran off from home, carrying the brainless dream any boy had thought of at least once. The trigger was on the night of a storm when he had an argument with his oldest brother. His brother had begun with, "What will you do with your future?" lecture to Wilhelm, immersed in only the sword, and minded to associate with brats and scoundrels in the territory. Through swinging a sword, he'd felt himself grow stronger and stronger, and that by itself made him happy. And so the older brother's words towards his younger, lacking any ambition for the future, were very strict. He had piled sound argument upon sound argument, and Wilhelm, deficient in words, spoke those words as the prelude to his flying out the door. He followed them with his trademark phrase, "You can't understand how I feel," and left. And in truth, the result was Wilhelm left his family with nothing but a sword and a small amount of money. It was an unplanned departure, but Wilhelm was able to safely reach the royal capital. Wilhelm, triumphant as he arrived, made his way to the royal palace with all haste, and records note that he entered the royal army as a common soldier. If it were the current era, a stray ruffian arriving in an attempt to pass through the castle gate under such circumstances would have been rightfully and properly turned away. However, at the time there was a civil war with an alliance of demi-human tribes centered upon the eastern lands of the kingdom. The demi-human war had long continued, and the urgency was so great that no number of volunteers seemed enough. It was then that a boy appeared, selling himself as having fair skill in the sword. He was welcomed with both hands, and Wilhelm entered the royal army without the slightest hindrance. Thus, unconnected to setbacks or travails, Wilhelm stepped onto the field of his first battle. There, for the first time, the boy came to know the wall called reality. His skill with the blade, unmatched on his home soil, served nothing against veterans of the field of battle, and he was confronted by his own recklessness and conceit. Such was the hardship of youth, the baptism of one's first battle. Yes, by rights it should have been like that for anyone. But in truth, without ever having faced live combat, Wilhelm's skill with the sword easily surpassed 15 normal youths put together. What? They weren't really as tough as I thought. In his first battle, the boy soldier had built a mountain of demi-human corpses, and from atop that mound he thrust his sword into his attackers. No one could behold him and not feel afraid of the blood-stained future that awaited him. Wilhelm's abnormal strength in the sword was multiplied over the days he swung a sword in his homeland. From morning to evening, until his energy gave out, Wilhelm had lived by counting to swing the sword every day from age 8 to 14, 6 years without pause. Even once he had entered the Royal Army, his lifestyle of devoting every free moment to the sword did not change. Within the same unit, there were perhaps one or two people who reached out to Wilhelm, but he rebuffed their overtures, immersing himself only in the sword for days and months until the boy became a man. Unbroken by reality, yet unsatisfied with himself, Wilhelm continued to swing a sword on the field of battle, unable to quench the feeling of gloom within him. With his blade, by rending flesh of others, bathing in their blood, and taking the lives of his opponents, he proved that he was stronger, and he knew that only in those moments did a dark joy sprout within him. As knowledge of his skill with the sword spread, the name of the rural-born swordsman, who refused all promotion to knight or anything else, became known both in the Royal Army and the Demi-Human Alliance by the alternative name of Sword Devil. A devil of the sword, rushing across the battlefield and smiling only when cutting a person down. It was a name that became synonymous with fright and hatred. Both friend and foe steered wide of him. His exploits were beyond counting, and yet there was no question of promoting Wilhelm to knight. He did not associate with others, stoically devoting himself to the sword, rampaging on the battlefield without regard for his allies, leaping into the enemy formation, dancing as he made flowers of blood bloom. Such a man could not be worthy of a flowery title such as knight. In a kingdom with a long tradition of chivalry, Wilhelm's existence was loathed as an interloper, regardless of his many services to the nation. And Wilhelm himself never once thought of changing that circumstance. He did not think like a knight with their high pride, regard for the lives of others, and their tendency to polish the nobility of their own souls. When he fought, he killed people. He made their blood flow and smashed their lives to pieces. He, who took more joy in that than anything, was not suited for knighthood. And if it stopped him from being able to enjoy that, he wanted nothing to do with being a knight. His longing for battle was warped, but over a great deal of time, the heart of the young man named Wilhelm rotted. And it was when he was 18, when he had been in the Royal Army for 3 years, and when none in the army knew not the name Sword Devil, that a gap in his heart was born. Alright, first hydration break. Wait, oxygen not included will still be happening on Tuesday. I had to cancel last Tuesday for reasons. But this Tuesday we should be moving into the new box base and bringing some new equipment online in the base. So there's some cool stuff happening there. All right. Thank you, Lemonade. I shall continue. A gap in his heart was born. She had beautiful, long red hair, and from the side her face was so pretty it made him shiver. With the enlargement of the battle lines, Wilhelm was temporarily sent back to the royal capital from the front lines, forced to take leave that he suggested was unnecessary. Separated from the battlefield and the rampant smell of blood, gunpowder, and death, Wilhelm, with too much time on his hands, slipped out of the castle gates with his beloved sword in hand, heading for the lower parts of the capital. Since running out on his own family, the treasured sword he had taken with him in lieu of a parting gift of coin had become greatly worn, but over the course of 10 years, he was used to that beloved blade, like none other. It was not that he could not use other swords, but when he was bent on taking the lives of others, that sword was indeed best. Walking all alone, Wilhelm headed down a street in the lower quarter with no sign of life. His destination was the very edge of the royal capital, a run-down district that had been abandoned midway through its construction. The capital went from the nobles' district through Market Street, continuing through the commons, and the abandoned district had apparently been conceived a ways back. But construction had been aborted quite some time prior, with no sign of resuming any time. The word was that it would likely stay that way until the Civil War was resolved. In the morning, the unfinished district had no signs of human life, and if any did exist, it would be scum gathering there for no good purpose. They were cowards who would scatter like baby spiders if a little antagonism hit them. Of late, not even those outlaws had come close to the Sword Devil, wholly devoted to the blade, unafraid and unawares when he entered the unfinished district on his days off. Just as well, I suppose. The reason Wilhelm swung his sword in the lower city, rather than at the parade grounds of the royal palace, was so that his ears would be undisturbed by the annoying voices, immersing himself into a silent world where he was alone. Wilhelm no longer sought to measure his skill by crossing swords with others. He turned towards the swordsman he imagined in the back of his mind, counterattacking his unleashed steel. The training he had continued since his youth always had Wilhelm crossing swords with the person he considered his greatest foe. Aren't you a bad looker? His eyes oozed with bloodlust. His lips were contorted in madness. The empty-eyed swordsman with whom he crossed swords every day was his reflection in the mirror. To Wilhelm, his greatest enemy was always himself. This was not in a philosophical sense, but rather a realistic view of his might. On the battlefield, he confronted his opponents. In other words, he took their lives. Having survived the battlefield, on the edge of life and death, there had been none on the field of battle to date that was mightier than he. Then what worthy rival was there to cross swords with than he? A man he could not kill no matter how hard he tried. Therefore, during his leave, he went to a place devoid of others, to immerse in a sword dance against himself. For it was only there, in a sword drama none would ever yearn for in reality, that he truly felt what it meant to be alive. Ah, I'm quite sorry. That day, the sight of a beautiful girl was the foreign element wedging itself into the Sword Devil's world. To swing his sword and meet himself in deadly combat, Wilhelm, on his way to the unfinished district, with that aim, stopped when he noticed a different guest ahead of him. Normally, the heart of the unfinished district Wilhelm used was completely empty. The footing was comparatively level, and the breadth made it an ideal place for him. And yet, a foreign element rested in Wilhelm's place of relaxation, tilting its head slightly toward him. To think someone would come to a place like this, and so early in the morning. The girl addressed Wilhelm with a little smile, but Wilhelm responded to the greeting with a simple slap of his antagonist aura to drive her away. He felt as if he was shooing away an annoying insect. An amateur amid such antagonism would beat a hasty retreat. Even a man of skill would likely perceive Wilhelm's level of skill and do likewise. But the girl did nothing of the sort. What's the matter? Such a scary face. She parried Wilhelm's antagonism, continuing her words as if they were nothing. Wilhelm felt annoyed, clicking his tongue. This was an opponent upon whom such hostility was ineffective. In other words, someone completely unrelated to the martial arts. At the very least, someone upon whom violence was effective would have shown some reaction to Wilhelm's antagonism. But to someone unconnected to such things, it was simple coercion. Depending on the opponent, someone might even receive it with a simple narrowing of the eyes. In the case of the individual before him, she was a shining example of the latter. Woman, what are you doing here on a morning like this? He hurled abuse at her, but she had yet to release Wilhelm from her gaze. The girl made a little at Wilhelm's words, and then said, I would like to ask you the very same thing.
But that would be a little bit too mean, yes? Your face says you have no sense of humor.
There are many dangerous men in this area. I cannot approve of a woman for walking around it alone.
Are you worried about me?
It is possible that I am one of those dangerous men. Wilhelm replied sarcastically to the girl's light-hearted comment, making a sound with the hilt of his sword to announce the presence of his weapon. But the girl did not turn an eye to Wilhelm's action, pointing behind her as she said, "Over here." The girl, sitting on a stairway, shifted her finger to a building opposite that against which she leaned. As it was a place Wilhelm could not see from his position, his brows furrowed at being invited to come closer. It is not that I do not wish to see, but...
Never mind that. Come on, come on.
Wilhelm's cheek twitched at the tone, like that used when coddling a child. But he calmed himself and went over to her. He walked alongside the woman higher up on the stairway, leaning forward to peer at what lay on the other side. On the other side, the hot rays of the morning sun were shining on broad, yellow flower gardens. With Wilhelm at a loss for words, the girl lowered her voice and confessed a secret to him in a whisper.
They stopped maintaining this district quite some time ago, yes? I thought no one would come, so I planted flowers. I came over to see the results for myself.
Wilhelm had walked that way many times, but not once had he noticed the presence of the flower garden, even though all it would have taken to see them was for him to stretch his back a little higher and broaden his vision. With Wilhelm's mouth remaining closed, the girl looked at the side of his face and asked, "Do you like flowers?" He turned to her, seeing the small, gentle smile her face made as he stared. "No, I hate them," he replied in a low voice, curling his lips. From then on, Wilhelm and the girl continued to encounter each other from time to time. On his days off, Wilhelm would walk to the unfinished district in the morning, only to find her having arrived ahead of him, bathed in a quiet wind as she gazed at the flowers. Then, when she noticed that Wilhelm had arrived, she would ask him, "Do you like flowers now?" He would deny it with a shake of his head, immersing himself in the swinging of the sword, acting like he had forgotten her very existence. When his sweat flowed and he raised his head, finishing his deadly struggle with himself, he would see the girl still there. "You really have a lot of time on your hands," he'd always say in a sarcastic voice. He thought that, bit by bit, the amount of time they spent speaking gradually increased. They always spoke after he'd swung his sword, but he began to exchange a few words before swinging his sword as well, and the conversations after he swung his sword also became a little longer. Gradually he went to that place at an even earlier hour, sometimes arriving to the flower garden before the girl.
"Ah, you're so early today," the girl would say, a regretful smile coming over her.
It must have been 3 months since meeting her like that before they'd exchanged names. The girl called herself Teresia, adding, for now, sticking out her tongue a little. When Wilhelm replied with his introduction, she pouted when he said, "I'd been calling you Flower Girl until now." He thought that exchanging names meant intruding onto each other's circumstances to some small degree. To date, their exchanges had been harmless and inoffensive, but their quality steadily began to change. One day, Teresia asked him, "Why do you swing the sword?" Without a moment's concern, Wilhelm replied, "Because it is all I have." As was typical, Wilhelm's return to military duty was greeted with days filled with the scent of fresh blood. In due course, the civil war with the demi-humans had intensified. Over and over, he casually carried out his missions, slipping past an enemy's magic into his flank, slicing them from toe to chin. He rushed over land, broke through the wind, flew into the enemy camp, and sent the general's head flying. He returned to his own camp with the head impaled on the tip of his sword, and bathed in gazes of acclamation and fright. He exhaled. Suddenly he realized that on the battlefield below his feet, even as blood flowed, there were flowers blooming, swaying in the wind. And now, without being conscious of it, he took care not to tread on them.
Do you like flowers now?
No, I hate them.
Why do you swing the sword?
Because it is all I have. It was a ritualistic exchange with Teresia. When they spoke about flowers, Wilhelm was able to reply with a small smile. But when they spoke of the sword, somehow it felt painful to give his stock reply. Why did he swing a sword? I have nothing else. He thought day after day, and there his thought process had ended. When he seriously pondered the question in search of an answer, Wilhelm turned back all the way to the day he had first held a sword in his hand. At the time, Wilhelm was yet to know that the sword in his hand would be bathed in blood. When Wilhelm saw himself reflected in the light gleaming off the pristine steel blade, what had he thought? One day, still in a vortex of thought, unable to come up with an answer, his feet took him to the usual place. His steps grew heavy, for he was filled with gloom at how he would face the girl waiting for him. Perhaps it was the first time in his life that he had worried his head about such a thing. Had he not continued swinging the sword without needing to think? Just when he had resolved to give such a nasty reply, Wilhelm, the girl there in the place ahead of him, looked back with a small smile as she called his name. Suddenly his soul shuddered. His feet halted and he could not help feeling nauseous. Suddenly, Wilhelm was assailed by a realization that seemed to crush his body. When he sought to cast everything aside with such a conclusion, that he had swung the sword without a thought, a variety of things he'd stopped thinking about and set aside suddenly spewed forth. He didn't understand the reason. The trigger wasn't set in stone. That moment, the bulwark he raised so long ago had abruptly reached its limit. Why did he swing the sword? Why had he started to swing the sword? He yearned for the glimmer of the sword, the strength, the purity of living by the blade. There was that, too. There was that also, but surely it had begun somewhere else. I have to do what my older brothers can't. It was because swinging a sword was a field largely neglected by his older brothers. Yet even so, it was because his brothers sought to protect their family in their own way that he, so useless to them, sought his own different way to defend them. Was that not why he was captivated by the strength and glimmer of the blade?
Do you like flowers now?
I do not hate them.
Why do you swing the sword?
It is all I could think of no other way to protect others. Ever since the previous ritualistic exchange of words ceased to be in place, he thought that their topic shifted around quite a bit. Before he realized it, he was heading there not with the aim of swinging the sword, but to meet Teresia. In a place where he should have been swinging his sword without a thought, his head somehow came to find that insufficient, and topics shifted to places away from the sword. Until then, his fighting style had been to charge single-handedly into the enemy formation and take as many heads as he could. But somewhere along the line, that changed to him running around with a focus on diminishing harm to his allies any way he could. The sight of him prioritizing his companion's safety over slaying the enemy naturally resulted in a change in how others saw him. Old war comrades that had stuck with Wilhelm since his bad behavior days were both delighted at the change in him and conflicted by it. For the number of people that spoke to him and that he spoke to both increased. Previously unheard of calls for his promotion to knight arose, and he spent only a small amount of time weighing the matter before accepting. Deep down, he too found having such prestige better than not. There were calls for my promotion, So I became a knight.
I see. Congratulations. That makes you one step closer to your dream, doesn't it?
A dream?
You took up the sword to protect people, didn't you? And a knight is someone who protects others. He felt that, among the things he wanted to protect, her smiling face stood out.
More time passed. Having become a knight and coming into contact with more people within the army, the information reaching his ears naturally increased. The deeply bogged down civil war continued, with an advance on one front matched by a retreat from the next. Wilhelm, too, experienced not only victorious battles, but defeats as well. Along the way, he spent his days continuing to struggle to protect those within reach of his sword, while bitterly regretting those things that were beyond his reach. It was by happenstance he heard the fires of war had shifted to the land of the House of Trius. That fact casually reached Wilhelm's ears from a newfound companion inside the army, namely, that the civil war had begun in the kingdom's east, had broadened, reaching all the way to the Trius domain in the north. There was no order given. So long as a knight did not forget the position allotted to him, it was impermissible for him to act on his own. But Wilhelm, embracing once more his feelings from the time he first grasped a sword, such things meant nothing. By the time he rushed to his beloved homeland, the advancing enemy army had already turned the area into a sea of flame. When the scenery that he had abandoned over 5 years before faded before the reality of a more familiar sight, Wilhelm drew his blade, raised his voice, and dashed into the bloody mists. He cut down his foes, trod over their corpses, and shouted until his throat grew parched as he bathed in blood spatter. The enemy's numbers were overwhelming. There was no reinforcements, and it was a land weak in fighting strength to begin with. Until that point, he had meant to fight in battle on his strength alone. But he learned the price, taking one wound and then another, becoming unable to move. Collapsing atop a pile of corpses, crushed before the numbers of the enemy force that still showed no sign of running dry, Wilhelm understood that death was coming before his eyes. The beloved sword that had long been with him fell by the wayside, for his fingertips were too numb and lifeless to hold it aloft. With his eyes closed, he looked back at half his life, during which he had done nothing but swing the sword. It was a lonely life, a life with nothing. Along with that conclusion came a momentary sight, and along the way, one face after another flashed before him. He remembered them one by one: his parents, his 2 older brothers, the bad friends he had hung out with in the domain, his comrades and superiors from the royal army, and finally, that of Teresia, with flowers behind her. I don't want to die. It should have been his true hope to live by the sword and die by the sword. But faced with the actual result of his way of life, devoting everything to steel, Wilhelm, with the end he should have desired before his eyes, was stricken with an unbearable feeling of loneliness. The enemy's soldier that had cut down so many of his comrades would not honor the final words he had let slip. Inhumanly large in body, they mercilessly swung their great sword down at Wilhelm. He would eternally remember the beauty of the slash that lashed out. A storm of swords blew, and in course the demi-human's limbs, head, and torso were cleanly severed. A great uproar spread among the enemy force, but the racing silver flash was faster, easily inflicting death in large quantities. Splattered blood rose up, the death cries did not cease, and the demi-human's lives were shaved away. The all too vivid slashes did not register even with those struck by them, managing no expression as their lives were snuffed out. Whether the acts were cruelty or mercy, no one knew. As to what was known, there was but a single thing. Surely he could not reach that realm of the blade in a lifetime, or even eternity. He had lived by swinging the blade, devoting the majority of his not overly long life to that purpose. And because of that, It was Wilhelm who could keenly comprehend the heights of the swordsmanship repeated over and over before his very eyes. So too, the fact that it was a realm he, a man of no talent, could never reach. If Wilhelm had created a valley of bloody mist in his homeland, it was truly a sea of blood that spread before his eyes. The literal mountain of corpses piled atop one another had no comparison. The silver flash did not cease its dance until every demi-human invading the Trias lands had ceased breathing. Having witnessed the overwhelming slaughter to the end, he was carried out by late arriving comrades from the royal army. They shouted various things and tended to his wounds, but Wilhelm never took his eyes off the sight. Finally, the slender, long sword wavered, and the sword fighter firmly walked off. Wilhelm shuddered when he realized that the sword fighter had not been bathed in a single drop of splattered blood. He reached out with his hand, but could not reach the back moving away. Most likely the distance between them was not a physical one alone. It was when he returned to the royal capital that he heard the true name of the one bearing the alias of Sword Saint. It was around the same time that the name of the Sword Saint began to reverberate in every land, instead of Wilhelm the Sword Devil. Sword Saint. Once upon a time, that was the legendary being who had cut down the witch, bringing calamity to the world. To that day, the men beloved by the sword god were the blood of that single family, and it was through that direct bloodline that one generation's Superman was born after another. The name of the Sword Saint of that generation had never been public even once, so too until that time. Next hydration break. Wilhelm's backstory is pretty badass. It's really good. When Tappei decides to segue into backstory, you're always up for a good time. Rem's backstory a couple of volumes back was really good too, and I really appreciated it. They're really good to read too because they're short, they're punchy to the point, just one chapter, and I can't get enough of it. Alright, quick bot check, clean the bots out of the chat, and we'll get back to it. We'll see how Wilhelm fares. It was several days later that his battle wounds had watched. Appreciate the host. Thank you. Links in the league. It was several days later that his battle wounds had healed, and he made his way to the usual place. Gripping the hilt of his beloved sword, Wilhelm quietly trod the soil as he headed for the flower garden. He was certain she would be there, and in accordance with his firm belief, Teresia was sitting in that place, no different from before. Before she could look back, Wilhelm drew his sword and leapt at her. Just before the semicircular cut would have split the girl's head, she caught the tip of his sword with two fingertips, bringing it to a halt. A sound of wonder caught in Wilhelm's throat as a malevolent smile came over his lips. Humiliating. Is that so? Were you laughing at me? Go ahead and laugh, Teresia. No. Sword Saint Teresia Van Estrella. With all his might, he raised his sword high and sliced at her again, but she evaded by a single hair in an undisturbed motion. A moment after the dance of her red hair stole his eyes, his feet were swept from under him. Unable to break the fall, he was cruelly sent crashing down. Even without a sword in her hand, the Sword Devil's blade could not reach the Sword Saint. An impregnable wall, a preposterous difference, was now evident between them. I will not be coming here anymore, Several times more, Wilhelm went slicing after her, and each time he was struck by a counterattack and beaten to the ground. At some point, his beloved blade was snatched from him, and as it rested in her hand, he was beaten by the hilt until he was unable to move. So far, so very weak. He could not reach. It was not enough. Don't hold a sword with that face. I do, for I am the Sword Saint. I did not understand the reason why I was, but I understand now. Reason, you say? You swing the sword to protect others. I think I can do that too. It was Wilhelm who had given Teresia, the girl who loved flowers, who could find no meaning in gripping a sword, that reason. All the more because she was stronger than anyone, the furthest beyond the reach of anyone's sword. Wait, Teresia. I'll take your sword from you. As if I care about your blessing or your role. Don't underestimate swinging the sword, or the beauty of the blade, Sword Saint. The woman did not stop. Her back grew distant. All that was left behind was a lone, foolish devil, speaking of the sword to her, who was loved by the sword. Afterward, the two would never meet there again. The sword devil vanished from the royal army. In his place, the name of the Sword Saint spread within it. A knight worth 1,000 men. With hard fighting by Teresia, the embodiment of those words, the civil war tilted in their favor. Though a single person, her martial feats were beyond the realm of any individual. And the alias of Sword Saint resounded. Even the demi-humans versed in the old legends despaired. It took 2 years after the Sword Saint emerged on the battlefield for the Civil War to end. The demi-human alliance lost those who carried it upon their shoulders, and when the peace talks were carried out somewhere between the current leaders on both sides, it announced that at minimum, the fight between those bearing swords had come to an end. Blessed by the end of the long Civil War, the royal capital gently opened up and began to flower. A ceremony had been planned where a powerful, beautiful sword saint would have granted several medals. People throughout the kingdom traveled to the capital to glimpse a sight of Teresia, the red-haired sword saint, the hero whose passion had single-handedly brought the long suffering from wild war to an end. It was then that the sword devil unexpectedly descended, as if to slice that passion asunder. The soldiers on guard became agitated from the incredible antagonism rising from a man with a naked blade in his hand. But it was none other than the Sword Saint, the flower of the ceremony, who checked them and advanced to the fore. Each turned their sword towards each other, almost as if walking onto a prearranged stage. When her long red hair fluttered in the wind, none failed to hold their breath at the sight of her facing the intruder. It was difficult to find words for an appearance with such refined beauty, yet so at one with the blade. The malevolent antagonism of the individual facing the Sword Saint was the polar opposite. Both the brown mantle over him and the skin underneath were filthy all over from the rainwater and caked mud. Even the sword in his hand was meager compared to the ceremonial holy blade that the Sword Saint held in hers. The blade of the well-made sword was crooked, with reddish-brown rust all over it. Though the king was seated on the same stage they were on, he halted the knights attempting to go to the Sword Saint's aid. When the Sword Saint stepped forward, and her swordplay glimmered, all pulled their chins back, and none raised a voice, watching in silence. At the beginning, no doubt many found the two figures having vanished from their sight. Blade recoiled from blade again and again. High-pitched sounds shot past the spectators. There was a chain of glimmers and sounds of steel as the two figures danced upon the stage at dizzying speed. Soon those witnessing the spectacle had lost their voices, their hearts going to and fro, overwhelmed with a vast sense of admiration. They battled with incredible force, switching where they stood from the ground to the walls to the very air as the swordplay of the two sword fighters blurred. Some even realized that the sight had brought them to tears. But as they listened to the orchestra of echoing steel, they instinctively shuddered, intoxicated by the sublime sight. They thought, is this really a realm that people can reach? Can the beauty of the sword truly instill such deep feelings in others? Their swordplay intermingled with locked swords, flashing tips, and repeated recoils. And finally, the discolored blade snapped in half, its tip sent flying, spinning round and round in the air. Then the hand in which rested the Sword Saint's ceremonial sword. Victory. Victory is mine. Oh, no, sorry, I got that wrong. Victory. Victory is mine. The holy sword audibly dropped to the ground, and the broken sword's warped tip came to rest just short of the Sword Saint's throat. The spectacle had made time stop, and all knew. The Sword Saint had lost. You're weaker than me, so you have no reason to wield a sword. If not me, then who? I'll carry on your reason for swinging the sword. You just need to become my reason to swing one. He lifted up the hood of his outer garment. The sullen face of Wilhelm glared at Teresia from under the dark, filthy cloth. Teresia shook her head a little at Wilhelm's behavior. You're a terrible person. You've made a person's determination, resolve, everything all go to waste. I'll carry on everything that's gone to waste. You can forget about gripping the sword and just take it. Yes, that's it. You can raise flowers and live in peace and quiet behind me. Protected by your sword? That's right. You'll protect me? That's right. Teresia placed her hand against the flat of the sword thrust toward her, taking a step forward. The two faced each other, close enough to feel each other's breath. Tears welled in Teresia's damp eyes, but they only conveyed her little smile as they fell. Do you like flowers? I stopped hating them. Why do you swing the sword? To protect you. The distance closed as their faces drew close. Finally, it vanished. When she drew back from the touch of their lips, Teresia's cheeks were red. She gently stared at Wilhelm as she asked, Do you love me? He averted his face and bluntly stated, You know I do. Just then, the people enthralled by the dancing of swords regained their senses, and a great throng of guards pressed close. Wilhelm's shoulders sank as he saw the familiar faces among the soldiers rushing over. Teresia's cheeks puffed up at his dismissive demeanor. Their smiles were like those they exchanged during the days they spent gazing at the flowers. Sometimes a woman wants to hear the words. Ugh. Scratching his head with a guilty expression on his face, Wilhelm reluctantly looked back at Teresia, drawing his face close to her ear as he whispered, Someday, when I feel like it. And thus he glossed over those embarrassing words. I need another hydration break. Good evening, Quaffle. Thank you for dropping by. Appreciate it. Hope you're having a good day, my friend. Hope you're enjoying the story time. And to answer your question, Amajiki, the answer is Magic School Bus. That's some quality children's entertainment. So how does Subaru get isekai'd? I believe it was just a blink and you're gone. Like he steps out of the convenience store and then he like blinks his eyes and he's in the market square in the capital of the Gunica. No truck, no spell, nothing, just snap and he's there. I know we all enjoy our truck-kun memes, but no truck-kun this time. The recycling bin, if you weren't here when this particular joke was made, was that some people call Subaru a trash main character, but that's because they're not seeing the long game. He starts out as a pretty trash human being, but the point of the story is to slowly turn him into someone better, which is why I say Subaru's not trash, he's recycling. We can make him into something useful. We'll continue on with Wilhelm's story. Alright, Yamachiki, take it easy. Oh wait, no, that was the end of the story. They kiss on stage, and so now we're back to the battlefield. Alright. He raced like the wind, and the gleaming, treasured sword rent the stone-like hide with ease. The shout the aged swordsman raised seemed to trail behind him. Whale blood spewed from the flesh blade wound, dyeing the sky scarlet. He appeared wounded all over his body. Then, as before, blood seemed to be dripping from his left shoulder, but the blood splatter drenching his entire body had mixed with his own blood, turning its color to black. Over such a brief period of time, no more could be expected from healing magic than stopping the bleeding and restoring a small amount of endurance. He was still in a gravely injured state, told he must have complete rest. But seeing Wilhelm as he was at the moment, none could laugh him off as an old man on death's door. Seeing the gleam in both eyes, seeing the strength in his steps as he raced, seeing the vividness of the slashes of the sword he wielded, hearing the ear-splitting cry echoing forth, and captivated by the glimmer of his soul, none could laugh off the old man's accumulated life as that of a fool. His blade ran, a scream rose, and the white whale's enormous, suffering body was racked with intense pain. With the demon beast crushed under the great tree, unable to move, the sword devil racing along its back did not hesitate to use his blade. The slash begun at the tip of its head, ran down its back, and reached its tail. When the sword devil stood upon the ground, he turned right around, rending its belly on the way back up to the head. In one swing, sharp, deep, and very, very long, the single flash of silver cut the white whale in two. With a leap, the sword devil came down onto the tip of the unmoving white whale's nose once more. He shook the blood off his drenched sword as he and the white whale looked each other eye to eye, their two fates merging together. I have no intention of speaking ill to you. There is no use exchanging good and evil to a beast. Between you and me, there is only the law of life and death. The weak are cut down by the strong. Sleep eternally. Leaving behind one last little murmur, the light faded from the white whale's eyes. Its enormous body went limp, and when it collapsed, the earth shuddered. The droplets of its fresh blood formed a muddy river. No one could put the feeling of blood running underfoot into words. A silence befell the leafless highway. And then, it's over. Teresia, it's finally... Atop the head of the immobile white whale, Wilhelm turned his face skyward. When the treasured sword fell from his hand, he brought that hand up to cover his face, and with a quivering voice, the weaponless sword devil said, Teresia, I... The voice was raspy, but there was boundless, undiminished love within it. I love you. They were words of love only Wilhelm knew. Things he had never told her. They contained feelings accumulated over many years. Words he had not spoken even once to the one he most loved, right up to the day he lost her. Finally, after the passage of decades, Wilhelm had voiced the words with which he should have answered her questions so long ago. Atop the corpse of the white whale, his sword fallen from his grasp, the sword devil cried out his love for his departed wife, and he wept. Here, the white whale has fallen. Haltingly, the sound of a stirring voice echoed across the silence of the nighttime plain. At that voice, the men, lost for words, lifted their faces. Their gaze poured over a young woman calmly advancing to the fore on the back of a white land dragon. Her long green hair was frayed, and she was cruelly adorned by wounds suffered at the height of the battle. Her face sullied by her own blood, a most sorry state for her to be seen in. And yet, in their eyes, the girl had never shone brighter. That was natural for those who judged the worth of others by the glimmer of their souls. With the knights gazing upon her, the gallant young woman lifted up her face and took a deep breath. Having lent her treasured sword, Krush's scabbard was currently empty. Accordingly, she thrust her fist towards the heaven, as if to show her closed hand to all present as she announced, "The demon beast of mist that menaced the world across 4 centuries of life has been slain by Wilhelm van Astrea. In this battle, we are victorious." With their lord loudly proclaiming victory, the surviving knights raised shouts of joy. With mist clearing over the plains, signs of night returned once more, a proper night, with the moonlight illuminating the people on the ground far and wide. And there, after 400 years, the Battle of the White Whale came to an end. It's a big chapter. That Wilhelm stuff, man. I love that. I love that man shit, you know? Put your life on the line for someone you care about. Just fucking put the effort in, right? I love it. So we're going to dip our toe into chapter 6. Just the first 2 bits. And then wrap it up on page 192. And call it a night. So yeah. That's we're pretty close to the end here already. So y'all know. All right. Let's okay. Remember to breathe, Amajiki. The air is everywhere. You'll be okay. Chapter 6. The Road to the Mather's Domain. An elated clamor spread across the moonlight-filled plains. The light of the moon reflected off the swords the knights raised high, with the glow of that light making the scene beautiful indeed. The white whale's enormous body rested on its side beneath the great flugel tree, as a zealous throng rushed to surround it. Everyone exulted in victory, with tears of gratitude flowing at their long-cherished wish having been fulfilled. As if to pour water over their joy, two powerful roars made the air over the Lithus highway shake, as if to paint over everyone's pleasure. Separate from the white whale that had been slain, there were two white whale offshoots that had lost the main body. Acknowledging the death of the main body, the offshoots above the ground writhed around as their vastness and solidity began to diminish. With their supply of mana from the main body severed, they were increasingly unable to maintain their flesh. They looked pathetic. Left to their own devices, they would surely dissipate within minutes. Crude. With that one disparaging word cutting them off, an arm swung, unleashing an invisible blade. Accompanied by a gale, the slicing wind entered one whale through its head, slicing the agonized white whale's outer hide in half with ease, and with its giant body neatly divided it into left and right. The being literally dissipated. With a single blow of an expeditionary force magic crystal cannon, the remaining whale broke into the mist from whence it came, its mana blown away, melting into the wind, whereupon its enormous body vanished completely. That told them, in a true sense, the battle to subjugate the white whale was at an end. However, we cannot simply exult in this. Touching a hand to her breast, Krush was aware of the jubilation inside herself, but she shook her head, refusing to let the deep emotion show on her face. With everyone's cooperation, they defeated the evil demon beast, and everyone lived happily ever after. The end. In reality, such a tale would not end so neatly. Such an ending was only permitted in fairy tales. Reality continued after the end of the tale, with a never-ending supply of things that had to be done. They had to provide relief for the wounded survivors, and courteous burials for the dead, leaving no corpses behind. And when Krush thought of such follow-up, she realized, at a place a little removed from the white whale, a man who had served with distinction was desperately raising his voice. Rem! Rem, open your eyes! Subaru lifted the girl in his arms, his face pale as he desperately called out to her. The land dragon came right up to them, nuzzling them with its black nose in an act of concern. But at that moment, Subaru harbored a sense of nervousness so great that he did not respond to even that land dragon's consideration. Subaru's plan to make the white whale chase his scent and crush it under the great tree was a splendid success. Some had raised their voices in objection, reluctant to cut down the historical tree. But the Beastman mercenaries were rationalists with so much compunctions that even when Krush deemed it necessary... But the Beastmen mercenaries were rationalists with no such compunctions, and when even Krush deemed it necessary, opinion easily shifted to his favor. Accordingly, Subaru, drafter of the plan, saw the operation through, shouldering no small risk in the process, resulting in achievement in battle that one would call second to none. But if this was the price he had to pay, it was the smallest of small comforts. This is no good. Please, Rem, if you're not here... Before his eyes, Rem calmly rested with her eyes closed, completely unresponsive to Subaru's voice. There was no sign that consciousness was still conveyed to her limp limbs, and the tearful voice calling her name seemed to pass right through her ears in a cry into empty space. Under ferocious pursuit by the white whale, they'd raced as the falling trunk of the great tree loomed near. The heavy weight of the great tree struck the demon beast squarely, with a loud crash to earth and a shockwave that flew indiscriminately throughout the area. And amid it was the sight of Subaru and Rem running right alongside. They were engulfed by the shockwave, losing track of which way was up, and Subaru recalled that he was protected by a warm sensation during that. The instant he grasped that feeling, there was a roaring sound from an incredible impact as he and the sensation were slammed into the ground. Slipping through the gaps of Subaru's vague consciousness was the realization that he was lying on the ground. And lifting his head, he realized who embraced him, and that it was her body that had embraced him to the very end.
Subaru?
Rem! With a twitch, her eyelids shuddered, and Subaru was reflected in the dim gleam beneath them. Reflected in her eyes, he looked so very weak, almost as if he was subconsciously recognizing the reality of what was unfolding before his eyes. And then he said, Yeah, it's me. You know, Subaru. Rem, your body.
Subaru, I'm so glad you're safe.
His throat choked up. For Rem, seeing Subaru, unable to even get out the tearful words of concern for her the way he wanted, was smiling at him in visible relief, as if taking no heed of her own injuries, happily so long as Subaru was safe.
What happened to the demon beast? It went down. We nailed it. It worked out. Everything worked out. I'm not hurt either. It's all thanks to you. Is that so? Then Master Rosewell and Lady Amelia shall surely be all right. It'll work out. Leave it to me. So, Rem, you don't have to say anything right now. Just rest. No, don't close your eyes. Ah, crap. What should I do?
She didn't need to force herself to speak, but if Rem spoke no words, he couldn't wipe away his own unease. Subaru was nervous, almost as if the relentless, coercive power of fate might yet snatch her life from his hand. He didn't know what he ought to do. He didn't know what was best to do. Not knowing what to do, Subaru couldn't help holding her hand and embracing her with his other arm as strongly as he could.
That hurts, Subaru.
Sorry, my bad, but if I don't do this, you'll go off somewhere.
I shall not go anywhere. I shall be at your side, Subaru.
Rem gave Subaru a little smile, like that of a mother consoling an unreasonable child in tears, when strength suddenly left her body. Subaru's throat froze in fear as he felt her body go soft in his arms. Inside his ears, he heard the sound of blood draining, of anything and everything leaving him behind. Rem? Rem! Please, Rem! Open your eyes!
Somehow, I'm very sleepy. I'm sorry. Let me sleep just a little, and when I wake, soon, for your sake I shall be.
Never mind all that. You don't need to do anything. It's fine. If you're together with me, so please, Rem. Even though she was right within his arms, Subaru wrung out his voice, desperately trying to hold fast to her as she began gradually slipping away. And yet, though Rem was right before his eyes, his voice did not reach.
May I say something selfish?
Say it. Say anything. I'll listen to anything. I'll do anything. So... In a broken voice, in a frail tone, Rem looked up at Subaru and made a little murmur.
I want you to say that you love me.
Tears welling up forced Subaru's eyes open as he shook his head side to side, and he drew his face close to hers and told her, I love you. I really love you. Of course I do. I can't manage without you. These were words from his heart of hearts. Subaru poured all his unembellished true feelings into the words he spoke that instant. He couldn't have made it that far without her. He couldn't live without her.
Ah, I'm so happy.
Receiving Subaru's confession, tears came out through her closed eyes. Rem's cheeks suddenly reddened as she happily accepted the words tossed toward her. With that, Subaru felt the last of her strength had truly left her. Wait!
I love you, Subaru. Don't kid around. Stay with me. Am I going to have nothing but regrets again?
He could not bear a future that did not have her in it. He understood that well before, and now her existence loomed far, far larger. And that was why...
I don't want to laugh and talk about the future without you. In that future, can I be by your side? Of course, I won't let you be anywhere else.
Closing his eyes, Subaru wiped away the rising tears before staring straight at Rem. And then he firmly stated, "You're mine. I won't hand you to anyone."
I shall take that as a commitment. Huh?
Abruptly, Subaru let out his voice like an idiot at the highly intellectual reply. And as he did so, Rem slowly opened the eyes she had kept closed all that time, proceeding to sit up inside his arms. Then, with Subaru dumbfounded, unable to grasp the situation, she tilted her head and smiled at him.
You have promised. I shall be at your side, Subaru. You cannot take it back now.
Where had the sight of her dying gone? In a teasing, toying way, Rem closed one eye and gently touched Subaru's lips. Crestfallen, Subaru's strength gave out from his shoulders down as he sank to the ground.
Why, you... Yes, I am Subaru's Rem, in name and in fact.
Hearing her trademark reply, now even more brazen, Subaru could not follow up his words. Even so, even if by rights it was a scene where he ought to be shaking with anger, the fact that the girl before his eyes was safe took precedence, leaving him too happy to do so.
We've both aired our true feelings, so that's really overkill. Girls are strong when they become honest about love, Subaru.
Subaru was flustered by how Rem no longer had any intention of hiding her love for him. More embarrassed than anything else, Subaru's face reddened as he let out a small breath and confessed.
If you died, I was about to die too. I am a lucky woman that you think so much of me.
I'm not kidding either. Rem replied with a light smile, but Subaru had answered with his true and sincere feelings. If Subaru had lost Rem, he would have most certainly attempted to do it all over again. Even if the chance to do things was not guaranteed to him, or not granted to him, there was no doubt he'd have tried anyways. That was how large a place Rem's existence now occupied in Subaru's heart.
I absolutely must not die then.
Darn right. I won't let you die, even if it kills me. Subaru drew his face to hers, and their foreheads touched as they looked at each other from so very close. Rem gazed adoringly at Subaru's gesture, and it was hard for Subaru to not just stay there with her close enough that their breaths touched. Naturally, his gaze was drawn in by her pink lips, and he felt his heart beat just a little faster.
Could you two wrap it up already, meow?
Ferris, looking exasperated from having watched from a distance as the two flirted, butted in to break things up at the most important juncture. Apparently, he'd been watching the whole time. Subaru was certain he'd done it on purpose.